Thank you. I'd like to really start where Carol finished off there in congratulating Brighton Stop the War in organising this meeting, because for the last 13 months, as she said, the great majority of the energy of the anti-war and peace and solidarity movements has, of course, been poured into solidarity with the Palestinian people, whose situation continues to be catastrophic in the face of a genocide that the world has not been able to stop. But while that has been happening, there has been this other war continuing, costing thousands and thousands of lives, and in which the British government is as implicated as it certainly is in what is happening in Gaza. And that war, the war in Ukraine, has taken a turn to a dangerous escalation in the last few months. As Carol said, that really began back in September, and the motivation for it was a perception that after 2.5 years, Russia's undoubtedly superior military might was pushing it to the point of overwhelming the Ukrainian armed forces, and that would be seen as a defeat for NATO. The second reason, however, has been the election of Donald Trump has alarmed Joe Biden and Keir Starmer, not just in general, but in relation to Ukraine, because of a perception that he will try and end the war on terms disadvantageous to the Ukraine and NATO. We don't know if that's what's going to happen. Certainly, Trump's Vice President, JD Vance, has been quite explicit along those lines, but there are other voices as well. But there is certainly a possibility. And so there has been this rush to escalate, with permission being given, having long been sought by the Zelensky government in Ukraine, to fire British and French and American missiles directly into Russian territory. And then these countermeasures of Russia using a new missile, so far just once in a demonstrative way, to strike a target in Ukraine. Now, the point about the missile use by Ukraine of British Storm Shadow missiles and their American equivalents is not merely that this is our munitions being used to hit targets in Russia for the first time since the British military invaded northern Russia in 1919 to try and strangle Bolshevism, but it's because these missiles cannot be used by the Ukrainians without the direct involvement of American and British military advisors. That the targeting, the coordination, the satellite, linking up with satellites, all of that requires a degree of direct engagement by the militaries of Britain and the US. It could not be satisfactorily done by the Ukrainians unaided. And that is why Putin says, and Carol's quoted it, that this is almost like a direct conflict. Even if the finger on the button is Ukrainian, the targeting and everything else that happens has heavy, direct NATO involvement. So the urgent thing is now to bring this war to an end, and we have a special responsibility because of the depths of British government involvement in it. This war, we only hear about one war, but actually there are 3 wars in one going on here. There is a civil conflict which has blown cold and mainly hot in Ukraine since its separation from Russia with the end of the Soviet Union, between an increasingly emboldened Ukrainian nationalism on the one hand, and Russian speakers or even ethnic Russians in the south and east of Ukraine. This war is, it perhaps was a conflict rather than a hot war before 2014, And it's one of the consequences of, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, what were internal republican boundaries of no great significance in the context of the Soviet state suddenly becoming interstate boundaries. And we've seen similar disasters between Armenia and Azerbaijan, between Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia. And this is a problem. When the Soviet Union was dissolved in haste, millions of people felt they were in the wrong place. The border between Ukraine and Russia, it is where it is, and from international law that is important. I'm not denying that for a second. But it could just as easily be 100 miles to the west or 100 miles to the east in terms of where it was placed. And so there's been a tension there, not one that could not have been resolved democratically had there been a will to do it. But absent that will, this has festered, and the overthrow, it really was a coup in 2014 of the admittedly corrupt but definitely democratically elected president who is more aligned with the east and south of the country, being overthrown by Ukrainian nationalists. So you have that conflict. You then have the direct war, the one we do hear about, which began, or at least escalated in February 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine. And we, in Stop the War, we said that was wrong. And we still stand by that position, that it was wrong. There were real provocations, which I'll come on to in a second, but the loss of life consequential on that decision by Putin is quite unjustifiable, and it has not, it has made peacefully solving the problems in the region more difficult. And of course, it cannot be defended in terms of international law. But to look at that in isolation is to miss a lot of the picture, because there's a third war, and Carol alluded to this, and that is a proxy war between NATO against Russia, with behind Russia as perhaps a secondary in the short term, but more important in the longer term object of China. Now, this proxy war, we have to start with looking at NATO. Carol's outlined its expansion since the end of the Cold War, an expansion which was, of course, in breach of promises made to the Gorbachev government at the time. Now, it is said continually, and there's a political consensus on this in Parliament, NATO is a defensive alliance. No one should be frightened, therefore, of its expansion. But that is simply not true. Formally, it was true until the end of the Cold War. The USA was endlessly aggressive, so was Britain, come to that, but it wasn't done under the auspices of NATO. But what's happened since then? In 1999, a war was launched against Yugoslavia. That was a NATO war. It was done by NATO. And Yugoslavia was not threatening any NATO member state with aggression. The occupation of Afghanistan, which lasted 20 years and ended so ignominiously, that was a NATO occupation. Afghanistan was not threatening any NATO member state with invasion, and is anyway a very long way from the North Atlantic. Libya, the disastrous intervention in Libya, which shattered the state with consequences in terms of refugees and migration and economic calamity for the people of Libya, are still with us today. That was a NATO intervention. I haven't mentioned the war in Iraq, because that was not a NATO intervention. It was Anglo-American, because France and Germany wouldn't go along with it, but the USA is obviously the major NATO power. Whether or not you wish to include Iraq in that litany, this is a record of aggression by NATO. None of those wars could be justified in terms of the powers, the countries being attacked, threatening NATO. Libya, Afghanistan, Yugoslavia, no capacity or intention of attacking a NATO member state. So it is not irrational for the Russian government to see the expansion of NATO to its borders as a threat. Already the Baltic republics are in NATO, but they're relatively small in themselves, and probably on their own they could not constitute much of a threat. Ukraine, a completely different matter. So the inclusion of Ukraine in NATO was a dagger at Russia's throat. Security, and there was an opportunity after the end of the Cold War to build a pan-European security arrangement in which everyone is secure because no one is left insecure. You cannot have a workable security arrangement which is based simply on threatening one country with encirclement, isolation, and possibly attack. So this factor of the NATO expansion is at the heart of the war, and it will have to be addressed if there is to be any peace settlement that lasts. Now, Britain has been in this war up to its hilt. Starmer has just recommitted to spending £3 billion a year on military aid to Ukraine, at the same time, as he says repetitiously, we have a £22 billion black hole, and we can't fund this. We've got to take money off pensioners for heating this winter. The two-child benefit cap must be maintained, and taken all the other measures with which you are familiar. So financially, we are deeply and ruinously involved. We are involved militarily. We give Ukraine huge amounts of arms, and it's been reported in the American press quite openly. British special forces are on the ground in Ukraine, and apparently they are deployed much closer to the front line than American special forces, which are also there. So the possibility of British soldiers being caught up somehow is not completely unthinkable. But we have a deep military engagement. The Chief of the British Defence Staff, Admiral Radakin, he's always popping over to Kiev, and it is no secret that the failed offensive by Ukraine against Russia last year was largely advised by British and American generals. And diplomatically, Britain has been deeply involved in trying to prevent moves towards a peace settlement. I mean, in 2022, in 2022, when the war began, a couple of months in, there was at least a possibility, I don't overstate it, a possibility of Russia and Ukraine coming to terms through negotiations being mediated by Turkey. Boris Johnson briefly stopped cavorting in Downing Street to dash off to Kiev and say, don't do it. Now, I'm not wanting to promote a conspiracy theory as to what weight that intervention had compared to other factors in stopping those peace negotiations going anywhere, but that nevertheless is what he did, and that has been a consistent policy of the British government since. It has been more aggressive in trying to keep the war going than the Washington government has, even, really, the Biden. So Britain is in this up to its neck. We now have to think about how we can move towards peace. We have to put pressure on our government, particularly if the American government does move towards saying it is time for negotiations. I think that will probably happen because Ukraine depends on, above all, American military and financial assistance. It is very unpopular in America, particularly with the people that voted for Trump. Getting more money through Congress to keep the war going seems to me improbable. Not impossible, but unlikely. So there will be that. What will the British government be doing? Will it be trying to consort with other European powers, France, Poland, possibly Germany, to try and fill the gaps and keep the war going? Or will it be allowing the peace negotiations to go forward? We have to intervene on the side of peace. And here we have a problem. As the chair mentioned, I work as a political reporter now for the Morning Star again, and so I report in Parliament, and there is an absolute silence of the grave on this issue. Bipartisan consensus No real opposition at all, other than such questions as Jeremy Corbyn personally may raise, 1 out of 650. That's not an accident. That's because Keir Starmer has bullied the Parliamentary Labour Party, or that wing of it, which would be normally raising the sort of concerns that Carol and I have raised, raising those issues, into silence. He did it before the war broke out, when a dozen or so Labour MPs signed a letter from Stop the War attributing one of the reasons for what was then the tension leading to war on NATO expansion. And he said, if you don't withdraw your names, you're all going to be kicked out of the Parliamentary Labour Party, in which case it would probably mean they would lose their seats and their jobs at the next general election. So they all folded. And now we have a situation, an extraordinary situation, where the British state is getting deeper and deeper involved in the war, when the risks to the British people, the potential risks, are rising, and there is this wall of silence. And if that is reflected at all around the country, it is because of this illusion that somehow the Keir Starmer and the David Lammy, who are clearly on the wrong side of morality and history in Gaza, are somehow on the right side in Ukraine. Like there's two Keir Starmers. There's one that scorns international law, that green-lights genocide, and the other's who's a jolly good chap standing up for national independence and opposing aggression. There is not. There is one consistent policy of alignment with US interests and US aggression, and about maintaining the world order that emerged partly during the Cold War and much more strongly since, of unilateral American domination. It is the same mentality which sends our one functioning aircraft carrier off to the Far East to try and fly the flag against the Chinese. It's the same mentality which signs the AUKUS pact with the US and Australia to escalate the nuclear arms race over there. It's the same mentality which had Starmer this week flying to RAF Al-Qatiri in Cyprus to praise them for all the work they do, which work actually is providing spy flights to pass intelligence along to the Israeli military in Palestine. So it's a consistent policy, and the dangers in Ukraine are one expression of it, and that is why meetings like this are so important, as it's a start to help people make those connections. There is not a single person, I think, amongst the hundreds of thousands who march for Palestine who also think that the policy in Ukraine is the right one, but they need to be given the confidence to express that, to join the dots and to oppose the war policy of the British state in Ukraine as elsewhere around the world.